We've talked about Live's mixer section in previous videos, so let's go a bit deeper and talk about some details that you'll need to know and about some suggested preparation for the mixing phase of a project. So I've got exercise 1 from chapter 10 open. And one of the first things I'll do when I'm moving kind of from the arranging to the mixing phase is I'll really take a look at my performance settings. First of all, let's take a look at the buffer. We've done this several times, so you guys should remember how to do this, but let's go to the preferences, which would be under the Live menu on a Mac or the Options menu on a PC. And we'll select Preferences and go to the Audio tab, and we're going to want to just make sure that we're set to one of these upper, larger amounts. And I'll often set mine on 2048 samples when I'm mixing so that my computer will operate at its peak efficiency. Now, there's some other settings related to our virtual instruments that are worth looking at as well. So, for example, on the sub-bass track, I'll point out here on Wavetable that I've got a bass part, but my polyphony is set to 8 on a part that's only one note at a time. So I can either reduce my polyphony, or in this case, I can set this to mono. Now, a similar issue here is the unison setting. So unison in Wavetable will allow you to stack an additional 8 voices on top of each note that's being played, and those additional voices will be detuned to give it a richer sound. But that all takes processing power. So if you're not using it, disable it like I've done here where it's on none. Now, if we go to the buzz bass track, we've got operator, and it's got a similar parameter here that's called spread. And this will stack a couple of additional voices so that you can detune the sound a little bit. If you're not using it, turn it off. Similarly with sections of the instrument that you're not using. For example, if you're not using the LFO, turn it off. If you're not using the filter, turn it off. Another performance-related issue is how you're using reverbs, and we're going to talk about this in great detail in an upcoming video, but I'll just point out that there are no reverbs on any of these MIDI or audio tracks. All of the reverbs are over on my return tracks, and any track that I want to add reverb to, I've just increased the send amount on that so that it goes to the related return track and it gets processed for reverb there. In that way, I can have 2 or 3 tracks of processing of this kind, which are being shared by the 15, 20, 25, 40 tracks or so that are as part of your project. So that will greatly reduce the processing that's being used. Now, let me select the drum verb track, and I'll just point out that this reverb has a quality setting. Again, this will add or take away from the CPU usage. So if you don't need that exquisite reverb tail, you might consider putting this on mid or economy to reduce the CPU load. All right, so now that we've kind of got the performance related issues addressed, let me mention that I'll do a number of things to kind of lay out my project. So you'll notice that I've got all of my drum related tracks grouped together, then my bass, my keyboard, my guitar, and my sound effects. And then if I had any vocal tracks, they'd be over here. So I've colored the track nameplates in a similar way. And you can do that by just clicking and shift clicking the group of tracks that you want to set to the same color, then right clicking and choosing a color from the contextual menu. Now, further organization I've done here is within a group, I've actually colored the clips on a track differently. So it just makes it easier for me to spot those tracks. I'll hide areas of the window. For example, you see that I've got my browser hidden, so I've got more space here in the window to operate. Similarly, if I don't need to see the I/O, I'll close that down. Now, one other preference that's really important is how your solo buttons work and the preference that's related to that. So let's go back up to Preferences, and let's go to the Record Warp Launch tab, and I'll point out again this option under Exclusive. Now you'll notice that I have that turned off for solo buttons. What that means is that if it's on, you can only solo one track at a time unless you override that by Command or Control clicking another solo button. With that disabled, I can now come down here and I can solo multiple tracks. Now, if you want to disable the solos, you can either do it one at a time or you can Command or Control click if you're on a PC, and that will disable all those solo buttons at the same time. Now, in a similar fashion, you may want to make adjustments to panning or volume or other things on a track and do that to a group of tracks. And we can do that. All you need to do is let me select my drums over to my marimbas by shift clicking. And now notice that I can grab the fader, it's moving all of them. I can grab the pan knobs, it's moving all of them. I can click the track activator buttons. I can do the solo buttons, and notice that I don't need to command click to release these. I can just click again. Because they're all selected, it will relieve all of those simultaneously. So that's very handy. Now, another thing that we haven't discussed that's important at this phase is the kind of pan knob that you're using. So the default in Ableton Live is what's referred to as a balance panner. And that means as you pull a pan knob to the left, it's increasing the level on the left-hand side and decreasing it on the right-hand side. And so by doing that, it's giving us the perception that that particular track is panned left or right. But there's a different option, and we see that over here on the guitar track, and this is called a split stereo panner. Now we can switch to that by right-clicking on the pan knob on a track and choosing that from the contextual menu, and we see here select split stereo pan mode. And now I've got two pan knobs like you would if you were working in Pro Tools, and I can grab one of those and I can push that. In this case, I'm pushing my mouse up, and now I'm setting a range that's mostly to the right side. So you can really dial this in to a specific range where you want that track to be panned. If you want to go back, you can just right click and you can choose select stereo pan mode now, and we're back to where we started. And if I just click that triangle, that will reset it back to its default setting. Okay, let's take a look at the master track next. And let me just mention, let me bring the I/O back up, and I'll point out that all of the tracks that are set to master will route their signal over to the master and then out whatever outputs are set here under master out. Now you'll notice that we have a Q out setting, and if you have an interface that has additional outputs, you can set that to those additional outputs. And you'll also notice that my solo button just turned blue. If I click on that, you'll notice that it now says Q, and all of my solo buttons on these tracks now have headphones. So if you enable one of those solo headphone buttons, and I had all these tracks selected, and that's why we see them all go to this Q setting. What's going to happen now is that the output of all of these tracks will flow to this Q output. And this is great if you're trying to audition a clip or a second song that you're using in a DJ set, and you want to be able to do that to an additional pair of outputs to get it set correctly so that when you're ready to launch that next thing, you already know that it's cued in the right spot. So let me disable that so we're back to normal solo buttons. And we'll talk about the pre and post sends here in an upcoming video. And then finally, I'll just point out here on the master track, if you click the track nameplate, you will see that we can put plugins on the output. Things like maybe a little bit of EQ or compression. In this case, I've got a limiter here, and I'm also using the utility plugin and experimenting a little bit with expanding the width of the mix and also trying to make the bass really centered and in mono. Now, let me finish by mentioning again that the one area of Ableton that is linked between arrangement and session view is the mixer controls. So anything that we do here will happen when we go over here. So for example, if I unclick one of these and I tab back over, you'll notice that those aren't soloed anymore. Now, I don't really like using these controls when I'm mixing in arrangement view, and I finish a lot of my projects in arrangement view. So a feature that I do really like to use is under the view menu, and it's this second window. This brings up a second window, and I've got it set here kind of split on the screen, but normally I would drag this to a second monitor. And that would allow me to be able to work in arrangement view, do what I need to do, but then use the mixer controls in this window to adjust the mix. For example, I can even shut down the bottom area and then move my cursor here to the top of the meter area and pull this up so that I'm really basically mostly seeing only the mixer controls in this window. We've covered a lot of useful mixer-related tips and suggestions, but there's more to cover. So check out the next video where we'll talk about how to set up and use sends and returns.